you and take the video off. I'm massively looking forward to this. Good luck, everyone on the panel.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I'm going to mute as well and just enjoy.
Oh gosh, I'm not looking forward to this now. Hi everyone. First, I'd just like to introduce myself, and I'm going to give everyone on the panel an opportunity to introduce themselves as well, and then we'll introduce the topic and then go from there. So I'm Nimish Ladd. I'm curriculum and research lead at the Creative Education Trust, which has 11 secondaries. So I'm really excited to be invited here today to talk to yourselves about lethal mutations, which we'll go into a bit more detail in a second. I'm just going to go around in the order that I have people here. So there's no preference. There's nobody I hate. So that's fine. So Christian, do you want to go first?
Hi, my name's Christian Shanks. I'm the head of history at an 11 to 18 school in North Yorkshire.
And then Louise Lewis.
Hi, I'm Louise Lewis. I'm a secondary science teacher, second in department, and a senior research lead at a school in East Yorkshire.
Kevin.
Hello, my name's Kevin McLaughlin. I'm a senior lecturer in primary education at Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln.
And then Joe.
Hi, I'm Jo Jukes. I am a curriculum and research lead for the Education Alliance in East Yorkshire.
Neil.
Hello, I'm Neil Gilbride. I'm senior lecturer in education and educational leadership at the University of Gloucestershire, and I'm the head of secondary teacher training.
And then Taj.
I'm Tarjan DeGill, and I'm a primary teacher. I'm teaching year 5 at the moment.
Fantastic. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us, everyone who's here in the audience, and those that are watching later on the record. Thank you very much for catching up. Thanks to the BrewEdCleethorpes team for organising such an amazing day, all the pre-recorded sessions, all the live sessions, and so much heavily research-informed practice being discussed today, from direct instruction, feedback, using graphic organisers. It's been amazing, an amazing day. And I guess what we're really here to talk about at the end is putting a lot of this into practice, so that it has an impact in the classroom. And that's a really difficult thing to do. There's lots of ways in which research can be applied in the classroom to actually have an impact, but sometimes it doesn't go to plan, and that's what we're here to discuss. So that's why I'm so glad that we're discussing lethal mutations. So I was going to ask as the first question to the panel, what do we mean by a lethal mutation? But then I realized what I'm probably going to get back from that is a lethal mutation of about 6 different answers. So what I'm going to go with is a definition of what we mean by a lethal mutation, and then we'll go from there. So if I ask others what it is, I get a whole host of different answers, and that would really highlight what a lethal mutation is. So lethal mutation is a phrase that was coined by Dylan Wiliam, and it's when good ideas, even when those are well-rooted with a massive evidence base, can be implemented or interpreted in a whole host of different ways. And sometimes those ways render those ideas ineffective, and sometimes even counterproductive. And if you want a blog to read on this, is a great one on the Ambition Institute website by Nick Rose. So the first question that I'm going to ask is, could the panel give me an example of a piece of research that, when it was implemented in practice, it didn't go to plan, or it didn't have the intended outcomes, or it didn't stay true to the practice that initially was research informed? So to give an example, interleaving is a great example of this, where staff have sometimes mixed up topics that are not related as part of curriculum design. So when interleaving talks about varying sort of ideas within lessons or across lessons, sometimes staff have taken a whole host of different ideas and mixed them about, which is actually counterproductive. So I'm just going to go around and talk through the panel and see if anyone's got any views on that question. So a piece of research that, when implemented, did not go to plan. So Taj, would you like to start us off?
I knew you were going to come to me. So I was thinking of the sort of concept of sort of Rosenthal's principles of instruction, and the idea that you cover old material in a lesson before you move on to new material. And I think that the lethal mutation that I was sort of witnessing at times was that there was a tendency to just cover old material for almost the sake of it. So the thing I was thinking of in particular was we were looking at literature, we were sort of retelling the story from the previous lesson or previous lessons, and it started to expand and expand, because actually they were starting to, the children were retelling the whole story from start to the point they'd got to, and that wasn't really the purpose of sort of that retrieval. I mean, what was the point of that? You know, was there something specific that they needed to remember and learn? And also it wasn't particularly connected to the writing they were doing. So it was like they were learning the story off by heart almost for the sake of it, rather than because it was something they needed to do. So they weren't really getting that in-depth learning of, say, the characters or the plot or the theme, which might have been a better way of going about retrieving the ideas from the previous lessons.
I think that's a great example. Louise Lewis, would you like to go next?
I knew you would pick me, Nim. Yeah, so just thinking about where kind of on a more national scale was the kind of whole debacle with feedback. And, you know, it features so highly on the EAFS Teaching and Learning Toolkit. And of course, we talk about the power of useful feedback, but then that dogged teachers' lives for a decade, and it was completely misinterpreted. It was deemed that we should be marking every single page, red pen, purple pen, the polishing pens, whatever pen that you can think of. And I'm a stationery addict, and even I was opposed to that. And, you know, that became such a kind of black dog of education, really. It created significant problems with workload. I would go as far as to say it drove a lot of people out of the profession. I know certainly I was on the brink of it with the demands of workload and trying to just keep up with the, you know, 250 books a week to mark. So for me, I would say nationally that's kind of the biggest scandal, the biggest lethal mutation is interpretation of the feedback research.
I think that's a really good example. I think the idea of it linking to workload is something that I know we're going to touch on later today, and the idea of workload multipliers coming out of lethal mutations. Kev, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to a time when I was teaching in the classroom. So I've started, as people sort of know, that I'm as a senior lecturer now. I have been now, this is my 4th year. But there was a time I was in the classroom, a long time ago. But back in 2008, a certain individual released a tome of work. It was John Hattie's effect sizes. And he wrote a book called Visible Learning, which you may or may not have seen. He wrote another book about 2012 about visible learning for teachers, so that you could get your head around what the visible learning stuff was all about. And just basically, for those who may not know, who are watching, he presented a case that involved a lot of strategies in education that seemed to work, or the ones that worked the best. And he presented these as interventions using a sort of a what works best chart. He used a meta-analysis approach on a huge body of empirical studies and research, and came up with these effect sizes. Effect sizes are nothing new, they've been going for many years, but he calculated effect sizes and presented them in a chart where anything that was above 0.4 in the so-called zone of what's worth the effort to put in the effort to achieve what's there. He presented these, and people started. What happened was that this is all well and good, right? It is. I think it's okay. But when you present this type of material to schools, who on earth has the time to sit down and go through all of this stuff with a fine-tooth comb, ask the questions that are really pertinent to individual schools? Schools look for, I'm sorry to say this, but a fast food option. They're called for infographic chart that's going to be an impact in the staff meeting. So when it was presented to us, for example, we had the infographic, and the head teacher basically said, just look at the stuff that's 0.4 upwards and look at the upper echelons, the top tier of effect sizes. Ignore the rest. And that's basically it, I think. And that might happen in many more schools back then. I'm not too sure now, but definitely then it was a case of what can we grab from research that makes a big impact really fast, but we avoid asking the questions.
I think that's a really good example, and I think that I know there's a big debate around effect sizes and whether you can actually replicate those sort of numbers in terms of growth within the classroom. So I think that's another great example. Joe, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I think one that's pretty topical at the minute is dual coding. And actually, Dave was just talking about in his last session, wasn't he, that kind of this idea that dual coding is putting an icon or putting a picture on a slide, and that can actually become more of a problem in terms of cognitive load for pupils if they're trying to work out what the icon is or work out how the picture relates. And hands up, I think that I've probably got it wrong at times too. So because I think that, you know, evidence is really, really complex, and trying to get your head around it and do it properly, it's not easy. So, and I also think we need to give ourselves a bit of slack, because if we're getting it wrong, at least we're trying. And that's I'm saying that to make myself feel better.
No, I think that's really important. The fact that actually what a lot of teachers are trying to do is try to engage with the evidence and put that into practice. I think as we go throughout this panel, hopefully be able to figure out a few reasons why things don't actually go the way that we want them to go, and why we can't actually replicate what these strategies are. Just touching back on what Kev was saying a minute ago, you know, that these magic bullets just don't exist. That people think that, oh, we can just pull this thing off a shelf and put it in place, and that's it. Everything's fixed from that, and things unfortunately just don't work in that way. Neil,
somebody had actually put in the chat something about do you have to be a good artist to be able to do dual coding effectively? And I think again that's a misconception, that we have to be good at art, which would be terrible for me because I'm awful at art. So I got a D in art for drawing an egg. How do you get a D for drawing an egg?
Nimish, can I just bring in about, because what was said about the iconography, I suppose, the iconographication of education, is that could that be a term? An unfortunate part of what's happening within, say, BGU at Bishop Gros University, when we introduced the whole idea of cognitive load theory and looking at dual coding, and we introduce it to our students, and we talk about what is happening, what research is saying, and what has been suggested. What happens next within things like presentations that they deliver is we start to see a rash of icons being presented through presentations with no real thought about why they're there. And Microsoft has got a lot to answer for having that little icon button where you just click and just look for things and just stick them on with no real thought. So it starts to ask questions. What is the real reasoning behind this? And that presentation that was delivered was so spot on, making you really think about the whole idea behind using these icons and what is the purpose of them. So just want to say
I agree entirely. I do apologize there. I think my internet sort of froze for a second. So if it does, someone else can just jump in and carry on like that. So that's fine. Neil, would you like to go next with your area of lethal mutation?
Yeah, sure. So mine, I mean, I was going to talk about assessment for learning, but Louise done a far better job than I would have. I'm actually going to say distributed leadership. You know, it was kind of brought in, you saw the National College of School Leadership, and then whatever it became, a basement in the DFE, really double down on this idea of distributed leadership in the early late thousands, and how it mutated to something in multiple different ways. I think what was interesting was the mutations occurred not just in practice, but in the research literature. So a recent review done by a colleague at the University of Bath found that in all the research of distributed leadership, there is not a single shared definition of the concept, which is absolutely fascinating. So not only did it occur in the practical world, in the kind of research world as well, but essentially I think what it mutated into was a mechanism by which to delegate responsibilities beyond to individuals below their pay grade, you know, to actually giving responsibilities far greater responsibilities and experience, expertise, and indeed what they actually earn on a day-to-day basis would justify, which I think as well contributed to a vast number of individuals leaving the profession early, as well as under a basic underlying assumption that people want autonomy. All people want autonomy. That's just not true. Actually, when we look at adult developmental levels, autonomy is a really hard thing to handle. So again, it was one of these silver bullets that was brought in with a raft of assumptions which meant that an idea which is legitimate, i.e. sharing of responsibility of influence within an institution, is not necessarily a bad thing, but taken without questions asked, taken early on in its research cycle without thorough theoretical application and theoretical development, can mean an idea which on the common sense level is perfectly acceptable, becomes this behemoth of something which ultimately ends up being rejected by the profession for usually a completely different alternative. So that was the lethal mutation that came to my mind.
I think it's really interesting that people think about lethal mutations happening in research literature as well, because I've seen it happen a few times in some papers that I've read where people have gone back to look over their work and thought, do you know what, that wasn't exactly what I thought it was, and it's now changed. And especially when they went away to put it into place. And it's interesting that assessment for learning came up earlier, and I know that you were going to mention that, Neil. And actually, it was Dylan William who coined the phrase lethal mutations, and it was Dylan William who was one of the driving forces behind assessment for learning so far back in the late 90s. I still remember in the early days of my teaching the wonderful assessment for learning rainbow, or whatever that was, and however we were supposed to pull strategies out from that. And I don't know if some of the younger teachers out there remember that, but oh my God, was it one of the most amazingly awful, useless pieces of information I've ever received in my entire teaching career.
Can I sorry to jump, but there was something that I think Joe said that was really important that you just said as well. Yeah. Not just as researchers, but also as practitioners, that we keep going back, that actually we look back at the implementation of our own private personal work, but also that of what we're doing in our schools. And that is part of ultimately avoiding mutation, is actually looking back to see if something has mutated, if something has gone beyond its original conceptualization. And I think that point Joe made was really, really important. And I think the point you made
I
as well.
I agree entirely.
Can I just jump in there, Neil?
Go for it.
Yeah, sure. So just to pick up on what Neil was saying there, I think we're in a very difficult situation where we've got effectively social research, and we have differing kind of sample sizes. And so we're taking something that, even with a decent sample size, if we're not thinking of a meta-analysis, if we are just thinking of a single study, even with a decent sample size, to scale that up onto a whole school level and then contextualize it as well, it's almost like it's inevitable. I mean, if we take educational research and think about its evolution, like the evolution of bacteria, because it kind of evolves at that same kind of pace rather than, a multicellular organism like ourselves, then those lethal mutations are inevitable. And it's for us, if we think about it as kind of a genetic situation, we need to have appropriate checkpoints in there in order to avoid that. And it's how, I think I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but kind of how we have those checkpoints in, and where do we go as a result of that checkpoint as well. So
totally.
Sorry.
100%. And that's where I think if we treat processes, and I know this will come up a bit later on, more especially implementation, more like a process rather than an event. I think that's one of the real key things. I know the EEF say that in terms of implementing research. It's huge. If we don't keep going back and checking on what we're doing, we're never going to get it right. Christian, would you like to jump in with an area of research that you think's not done what we expected it to do?
Yeah, I think that obviously some good ideas, and I would have jumped immediately in, I think, with feedback and that whole area as well. I think one that's increasingly coming as obviously being very important is around the curriculum. There's a lot of obviously work that's going on in schools around the curriculum, and I do think that, and obviously there's been a lot of research. We've had people like Young and Hirsch that have talked about the importance of knowledge and so on and so forth. And I think that has led to some unhelpful practices. So, I mean, one that springs to mind is the knowledge organizer. So I remember seeing the knowledge organizer as a thing. I think it was on Joe Kirby's blog. And I thought that's quite good. As someone that had been dealing, and this must have been around mid 2010s, I must have seen that for the first time. And, you sort of having dealt with for years a sort of the whole de-emphasis of knowledge as being actually intrinsic to good teaching before then, it was quite refreshing. And obviously as the curriculum aspect has kind of taken hold over the last few years in light of the Ofsted changes, I think a lot of schools have latched onto this. And we've seen teachers producing, swathes of knowledge organisers and then not actually using them. But they look nice in kids' exercise books, don't they? It shows you've done curriculum because you've got a knowledge organiser in them. And I think it was when I actually read the Michaela book, the Battle Hymn of the Tiger Teachers, and actually really tried to understand how they used them, as they seem to be one of the pioneers of this method. And when you realize that that's actually intrinsic to their entire teaching and learning approach, it's intrinsic to their homework, it's intrinsic to what's going on in class, it's intrinsic to their, interventions after school and things like that. And I think a lot of schools just did them as a bolt-on. Here's a thing that we can make our teachers do to wave in front of the Ofsted inspectors to show we've done curriculum. And I think that was a huge waste of teachers' time. And it was this, and again, it links this idea that curriculum is just another thing that we can say that we've done it, right? We've done the curriculum, we've made it knowledge rich. We spent 6 months on it, it's done, let's move on to the next thing. And it forgets this idea, and Christine Council's talked about this, isn't she, that curriculum is all about evolution, and it's like tending a garden, and you're constantly, evolving it and changing it and tweaking it, particularly in subjects like mine, where the knowledge is contested in history as to what kids should learn. So to me, I think that's an area where, moving forward, and I'm really pro curriculum. I think it's welcome that this change has happened, but I can see people who maybe haven't been bought into it in the past. They're now being told they've got to do it by Ofsted. And then that brings in a whole host of unhelpful policies in schools that do all the things that all these other lethal mutations do, add lots of workload without really teachers feeling bought into what it's all about.
Yeah, I think there's a whole host of good points there. It does lead in neatly into what we've got almost as our next question, which is why we undergo this process of failing when we are trying to implement these research informed ideas, and why these ideas do mutate as they go along. And I know, Lou, you were touching on a few of these a minute ago. So would you like to sort of start us off on that area? Sorry, you're muted, Lou.
Course, and at least I managed to get that into the panel. Am I on mute? Right. So I think we've got this issue where it's almost inevitable, and I don't think we spend enough time planning for that inevitability. And I think when we've got research informed ideas, regardless of whether it is educational research or if you've got lab-based research, it can very easily get lost in translation. And that's from person to person. And because we've all got our own theories of action, we've all got our own cognitive bias, we bring so much of ourselves to whatever it is that we are learning, then we take from it what we want to take from it, we take from it what suits us, or what we already understand. So there is that level of inevitability there. And yeah, for me, I think it's about what we do with that inevitable situation. How many times did I say inevitable there? Wow.
700 million. Yeah.
Next. Oh, thank you. I thought it was a gazillion, but still.
Kevin, would you like to come in next there?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it in the first part, the first question. The answer to that is it's giving us, the schools, giving people time to to question this research that's been presented to them, the ifs, the buts, the maybes, all those pertinent questions, and to be critical of that research, whether or not it's actually going to be of benefit to the school, to the children in that school, if it's going to improve the teaching, if it's going to improve a pedagogical approach, if it's going to improve learning that happens in the classroom, rather than just looking frantically for that next big thing that's going to make a big impact because they heard something on Twitter, or there's a school down the road has been raging on about it. It doesn't mean it's going to work in the context of every single school. So that's one of those things. Was it Dylan Williams mentioned something about that? Does anybody remember what he said about something about things working everywhere but not what was it?
Everything works somewhere, but nothing works everywhere.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And I think it's very useful to keep that in mind. As somebody who's now out of the practice of being a teacher in the classroom every day, and now working in an academic world, in an academic field, I can see how powerful academic literature can have an impact on schools. And schools are just looking for something that's going to work very quickly. So why am I going to sit down and read a 400 to 500 page booklet with lots of charts and diagrams? Just give me the page that I need. Just give me the stuff that I need to put into place quickly, and then I can tick it off when I'm doing lesson observations or performance management. So
I think that's really important, that, you know, we digest research, and we take time out to digest research, and we're not just saying, you know, here's this 40-page thing like you're saying, and yeah, go away and read that and come back with your thoughts. But actually we build in the process of actually, this is the salient points, these are the key points that we're actually do something with. Let's try something with it, then let's check that it's doing what it should be doing, and keep going through that process of trying, checking, I guess. Taj, is there anything that you want to check in here?
I think, well, it's funny that, you know, people mentioned the marking workload thing and it affecting people's people staying in the job. So I actually left for a couple of years precisely because of that, and kind of then sort of came back in. But part of that meant that I had a couple of years where I was reading quite intensively, and I was reading blogs, I was reading books, but I know full well that I wouldn't have had that kind of opportunity and that kind of time to do that if I was working full time, because just on the wheel, let's face it. So I think part of the problem is that people don't have the underlying schema sometimes themselves. I think they don't have the knowledge to link that knowledge to. So the way it comes across is that this is just another initiative, exactly as Kevin said. Yeah, this is the next thing, and you have to do it and you have to implement it, and it's got to be done at, you know, breakneck speed sometimes, because you're in that Ofsted window. So the reason for the mutations, I think, often is because there's not a sort of long-term plan there. I think we're still affected very much by short-termism and the Ofsted window far too much when it comes to curriculum design, but also just school improvement in general.
Yeah, I think there's so much that we can do there, especially when it comes to curriculum, like Christian was saying earlier, that can mutate, and we just need to be really mindful that things don't happen there in that way. Christian, anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, so I mean, I really recognise what people like Tarjindra are saying there about this, in a sense, the accountability pressures that we all face demands this short-termism. I think that, for me, one of the things that I think is an issue is that a lot of people in education have not thought. And some of this is when you've got inexperienced people, it's understandable. But I think a lot of people have not thought about their own kind of philosophy of education. You know, what do you actually believe in? What do you want for your school? You know, what do you want for your institution? What type of institution do you want to work in? You know, do you believe that it's important that schools have discipline and rules and an academic curriculum? Do you believe it's important that children are given the opportunity to learn by doing, to be creative, whatever it is? You know, there's different schools that have very clear and very distinct philosophies about what they want to do. You know, whichever one you agree with or disagree with is beside the point. But I think a lot of leaders, and I, you know, when I was an assistant head a few years ago, you know, I put myself in this bracket. I didn't really know what I believed. And therefore, when you're confronted with things that happen, you haven't really got a frame of reference to make good decisions about what to do. If all you're concerned about is getting a good Ofsted report and getting good exam results, which I think are a byproduct of the principles that you have, you know, you have the philosophy, you have the view about what works, that other stuff then comes along by the by, doesn't it? Rather than that being the end goal. And I think, you know, because people don't have a kind of a blueprint for themselves about what they think, and amongst leadership teams, you don't have that kind of alignment in a lot of schools. There's a lot of kind of, you know, it's real open house. People can kind of do whatever they sort of want, which sounds really good, and it gives you that autonomy that I think somebody mentioned earlier, you know, that maybe people value. But actually what you don't then have is a direction about, as a school, we're going in this direction. I think that can become quite frustrating. I've certainly changed my view on that. And I think, therefore, when you're presented with new ideas, when you're presented with this new thing that's important, you don't have a way of actually thinking about that and processing that and thinking, actually, you know, oh, actually, this is a good, I think this is, my gut instinct is this is a good idea, let's look at it more. Or my gut instinct is, I don't really like this idea, but I should probably just check it out anyway, or whatever. I think people just think, oh, well, we'll just do that because I'm being told to do it. And I think as leaders, you've got to have the real kind of foresight to actually be a protective shield for your school and to kind of, this is what we believe in here. And okay, there's other stuff going on, but we're not going to let all of those things just come into our institution. We're going to just think we're going to be a bit of a filter, and fizzle out, phase out weaker ideas and stick with the ideas that we think are working or we know are working or whatever. So I think leaders having more of a bit of it sounds a bit grand, but a bit of philosophy about education and what they believe in and what they think works based on what they've read and what they've understood and their learning and their experience over time is probably going to help a bit.
Yeah, I think you've got a lot of key points there, especially about the idea of having this almost golden thread that leadership teams often have, that they attach ideas to as things go along, and making that clear and transparent with your staff. Neil, I've seen your face turn a few times. I think you've got potentially something controversial to add here.
I think I do. I think I disagree with what's just been said. And I think part of my broader point is we actually know very little about decision making. We know very little about how teachers make decisions. We know very little about, as a broader point, how we make decisions in complex environments. When we look at alongside the other issues of that, we have very low tolerance for theoretical research, which can take years. Actually, most research does not come up with a transportable answer. A lot of research is about, particularly in the science discipline, doesn't ever go near a classroom. For a start, I think we do have immature research networks in terms of that they've only just been started in the last 5 or 6 years. We really don't know how knowledge moves through an education system. Elizabeth Farley-Liverpool's done a lot of research around this. But I think ultimately, when we think about decision making, it's not actually about individual school leaders and individual school teams deciding what they think is right. That filter means that then it's only through their decision-making lens, which is why we get huge amounts of variability within a system. When we're talking about decision-making from an adult development perspective, the hardest thing about decision-making in a complex system is that it's not just about whether you follow the rules or whether you go with what you feel is right. It's actually about trying to make sense of what you think in light of what's going on around you. It's trying to find a middle way that actually you feel aligned with your own moral, philosophical beliefs, but actually with what's going on outside in terms of wider literature and research. It's a combination of the two. And that's what makes decisions making very, very hard in these environments, is that, yeah, you can follow the Ofsted book to the word, to the T, and you won't be very responsive to what happens next. You could equally throw the Ofsted book out of the window and your staff might be thrilled, but ultimately, when you come to your next inspection, your institution will not have a long shelf life. It's actually about balancing the two out. And that's what's very hard about decision making in these environments, is that you might have a philosophical belief, but ultimately that philosophical belief has to interact with a wider system of demands, legal, statutory explanations, but also research explanations as well. And I think that decision making is far more complex than having your own philosophical position. That's part of it, and being aware of that. But then you have to interact with a wider system, and as well as other valid perspectives as to what does and does not work.
So I guess part of what we're getting at here is that, yes, there's orders for research. Yes, there's a contextual understanding of your school as well. I think those two things do come hand in hand. And if you have a vision that this is what works and this is what's going to go forward, you've got to be willing to let that be shifted and have that fine balancing act, if I'm getting this right, Neil, between what is working, what people are saying is working as part of understanding what the process of learning or the process of change or the process of whatever it might be, but also having that influence what you're doing within your school from your contextual understanding. Is that almost like the point that we're getting to?
I think so. For me, at least, this is that you can't just go off what you believe is right. Yeah. And that's the problem, is that and I think this is why we get resistance to particular, and why we have binary, trad, prog, etc. Because ultimately comes, well, I know there's evidence, but I don't believe it's right. so I'm just going to park it. Actually, that's not how we can make decisions in complex environments. We have to be willing to look at our perspective our own perspective in a critical lens, whether that's a deeply held philosophical belief or not, in light of the broader range of research and evidence that we might find unpalatable according to our philosophical belief. Well, yeah, fine, but you still have a school to run in a complex system. And that's what's very hard about decision making at a system level. And I think it points to a lot of what Louise was saying about actually how we use evidence. It's not as simple. It's a very complex instrument.
Yeah. Louise, I saw you had your hand up. Do you want to jump in there? I feel like I'm
Yeah.
talking on Teams.
Sorry, I do. I know, yeah, I was actually like frantically searching for the raise hand function, but I couldn't find it. So my actual hand had to do. Yeah, so just to pick up on a couple of those things. I mean, clearly you're highlighting the complexity of it, and you know, we're dealing with complex beings, and you know, of course everyone has that underlying philosophical belief, and that does in itself introduce those cognitive biases. We also, you talk about the contextualization of research, but again, that in itself would introduce lethal mutations, because are you actually contextualizing it, or are you changing it completely? How does it go from being a contextual thing to not being the thing anymore? And I think also we're in a position where, and particularly when we're thinking about educational research, actually we're thinking about things being either right or wrong, and when we're dealing with humans, it's very rarely that binary. And to bring it back full circle to the idea of lethal mutations, you know, how do we make it fit both for us as teachers, us as leaders, but also suit our learners? Because actually, as teachers and leaders, we're expected to be a kind of jack of all trades and master of them as well. Because what we're thinking about here, thinking about educational research, we've got cognitive psychology, we've got neural development, but then also you chuck into the mix policy making, then you've got legal requirements, and that's even before we even touch on pedagogy, which is meant to be our bread and butter. So actually I'm not even actually convinced I know what point I'm making here, other than to say, you know, that each stage that we take educational research away from the lab environment that it's done, it stops being the thing. It's no longer the thing in the classroom, is it?
No, because empirical evidence forms such a huge part of this. You know, what happens as part of our practice and our understanding when we're actually working within the classroom forms such a huge part of what we understand about what works. There's been some great questions just chucked out in the chat that are related to this in terms of philosophies of education. I know Neil mentioned something about that, Christian mentioned something, but I haven't touched on Joe yet, so I'm going to go to Joe on this in a second. Do you think an individual's philosophy of education is set, or can it change? And if it's set, what do you think's influenced it? And if it's changeable, what would change it?
Are you asking me this question?
Yes, please, Joe, if you go with that first.
Okay. So no, I don't. I mean, I've been teaching for 20 years, and I think that over that time, my philosophy has changed without a doubt. And I think the thing for me that changed it was access to evidence. And I mean, when I did my teaching practice, it just was not part of my training. Sorry, my teacher training was not part of my training at all. I came to educational evidence quite late, and but that has really changed how I think about what the purpose of education is. Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I still remember when inquiry-based science was all the rage back in 2010, 2011, and I remember an old second department of mine, Gemma Jones, who sat with me and said, right, we're doing this. And we tried it for like 2 years. And we realized that more and more as we were investigating what we were doing, it just wasn't working at all. And then the more and more we worked with it, we thought, well, actually, what we're doing is direct instruction, not an explicit teaching, not inquiry-based education. And actually, we realized that's what work, that doesn't. So even though we started with this philosophy of going in one direction, we realized we were going completely in the other. And it was all contextual. We realized that this is what worked in our setting, and we found the research that matched it and buddied the two together. Neil, have you got anything to add regarding the whole idea of philosophies of education and whether their setting can change?
I think they can change, but adults find change an incredibly difficult thing to do. And so this is where my kind of more adult development hat comes in, is that we think adults are born for change, we're very resistant. Indeed, children are resistant to change. And I think this is where we think about, you know, some of the later questions about what allows for research to thrive is actually a challenging environment, one where actually challenge and candid challenge both within a system and within within a school is vital, but so is the safety. Okay, and that's the thing, is change is actually an anxiety-inducing process. Actually having your underlying beliefs challenged is an intensely anxious place to be, and particularly if you're so for example, Nimish, I imagine that situation that you were in was quite scary. The idea that you were, really scary, right? Now, that fear can promote change. It can also make us double down on what we're doing, which sounds paradoxical, but that's actually quite a legitimate way of responding to fear and challenges, to double down. So that psychological safety of being able to take risks in a more safer environment, having that kindness and candidness built throughout an organization is absolutely critical. It's not just access to information, it's also access to information within a safe, psychologically safe context. But that shouldn't be taken with not taking risks or not feeling that anxiety, because that's going to happen when you try and induce change.
Yeah, and I think a lot of things to do with uncertainty, with the uncertain situation we're in right now, breeds similar sort of thought process and similar feelings within people. And I talk a lot about, with the staff that I'm leading right now, reverting to type, and people just going back to what they know, to what they find comfortable. And I think trying to move against that is a really, really hard thing to do. Christian, you've got anything you want to add about the philosophy of education and how it's changeable or set?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's changeable. I mean, people's views evolve as they gain greater experience. You know, just speaking from my own personal context, you know, my views about education have evolved because I've worked in 5 schools now, you know, and I think I've seen things in different contexts and different settings, and seen lots of common sort of problems in some of those schools that seem to hold them back, and also some common things that in my empirical experience at least seem to work, so or seem to work more often. But obviously, as has been pointed out, you know, education is somewhat unpredictable in some senses. Children are unpredictable in some senses. So obviously, and the teachers themselves, you know, are able to make certain things work better than other things, depending on their own personal qualities and strengths and weaknesses and so on. So I guess my point, which I know Neil pushed back on a little bit earlier, is to say that it's not about suggesting that we should ignore, you know, wider research if it doesn't fit with our worldview. Absolutely not. You've got to engage with contrasting points of view. That's how we end up in sort of this hyper partisanship we see in politics, for example, is by ignoring other points of view. That's dangerous. But my point is that I think we've just got to reflect and think about our experiences and think about what we're doing. And that enables us then to have a framework to deal with new information, new evidence, new situations as they come to light. You know, and to be able to suggest some ways forward. But also you got to be aware that they might not work, you know, and having worked in, you know, I'm currently working in a rural school in North Yorkshire. I previously worked in an all-girls grammar school. I previously worked in a very mixed inner-city Leeds comprehensive school. You know, those are 3 very, very different settings. Some things work well, I think would work well across all 3 of those schools, but there are other things that certainly wouldn't. But it's only through having that experience myself can I really realize that. I think a lot of people get kind of tunnel vision because they're in their own setting for such a long time, and that gives you less flexibility maybe to respond to new things as they emerge.
I think that's so key where you mention a framework, then having a framework for this sort of process, so people understand how am I supposed to engage with this? What am I supposed to think about? What am I doing? Am I displacing what I've got already? Am I adding to it? Am I doing something different? What am I doing with what I've got? I think that leads neatly into the next question, which talks about how do we prevent these mutations taking place? And I know we've touched on this in a whole bunch of different ways, but how can educators and leaders actually prevent ideas, especially that are research informed, undergoing this whole idea of lethal mutation? And what role does empirical evidence from the classroom play in this? And Kevin, I'd love to come to you on this first, if that's okay.
Oh, you would, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would, of course.
Well, obviously, if I had an answer for this, like an answer that would suit everybody, then perhaps I'll just keep it quiet and sell it.
Write a book, Kevin. Write a book.
Yeah, write a book. Yeah, I've got no time for a book. Right. Do you know of the writer Biesta, the thinker? Okay, so I think it was 2019. It was talking about an example where interventions that help improve test scores, right? You know, to achieve good results in the PISA or good results in national tests or whatever it might be. Those interventions that help children or young learners achieve better in that. That they may not actually help children have a meaningful context about where they're going for the rest of their lives. And you suddenly have this, this issue between what should you do best for your school in relation to what is expected of the school and what you should do best for the children in your school and what's best for their lives ahead. A bit like what Neil was talking about, making those huge decisions from the top end of the school, from the leadership end, right down to the classroom teacher, the TA, who makes an on-the-spot decision in that class at that time to affect change with a child or a younger learner. Yes, it suggests that we shouldn't be looking. He talks about what we shouldn't be looking at. Just what educational research is presenting to us as like what's working, but I go back to that idea of being able to ask those questions about why does it work, who does it work for, and will it work in the context that we've got in this particular school. A big issue with what you're talking about, empirical evidence playing into this. I think school improvement itself, when we focus on school improvement, it leads to a focus mainly on test results and a measurable progress, measuring the progress to identify those improvements that you make through an implementation such as a research-based methodology, an evidence-based methodology approach. And again, BSF warns us that it's really easy for schools to put stuff like this into practice, measurable progress, looking at empirical evidence that you can suddenly get all this data that demonstrates things are working, but then that itself becomes a perversion of what education is really all about.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting thinking about school improvement under that framework. Like, if I'm brutally honest, one of the things that I've always thought about school improvement is that ABC model of it: attendance, behavior, curriculum. If you get things sorted in that sort of order, you'll generally get things improving. But what I've learned as I've done this more and more often is actually, there isn't something I can lift off a shelf to improve attendance. There isn't something I can lift off a shelf to improve behavior. You've got to know what's happening in that context. And almost like the first 3 to 6 months in any job is just listening and finding out about what's going on, and then trying to put that into play in some sort of way, getting, really having that proper formal knowledge about what works generally, but having that contextual knowledge about what happens in this school. And that's the hardest thing to pick up. Why are things not working the way you want them to in this school? And how can we actually put what we want in place? But listening is so key as part of that process, I think. Absolutely major. Louise, anything you want to add to this in terms of how we can prevent ideas undergoing lethal mutation?
Absolutely, I do, Nim. So for me, it's a kind of multi-structural approach. So inevitably, in order for us to be able to digest and implement strategies from educational research, we need to understand them. This is about knowledge. And we need to have a really coherent curriculum, both for teacher training, which I know that's been like a huge discussion when we look at Twitter and people biting about whether ITT is good enough and it's not good enough, and people getting offended by that. And I think the reality is we have a real mixed bag with ITT. Jo talked about her experience a while ago. I've not been teaching quite as long as Jo, but my experience wasn't research informed. There was a bit of evidence in there. Dylan William definitely reared his head, but it wasn't research rich. And I spent time before I was a teacher working in research. Was I research literate? Probably not. And we do, as teachers, need to really understand how to be research literate. And we need to think about the kind of adult learning environments that we provide for our teachers. And if you've got someone who is leading CPD, they genuinely do need to be an expert in that, not because they've read a blog about it, but because they genuinely have that deep-seated understanding. And I think, you know, with the best will in the world, and this is certainly not meant with any offence at all, I think, and there's a lot of us that are getting better at understanding these things, but unless you've got Dylan Williams standing in front of you, how we translate his ideas into educational practice, that ultimately at this point in time, because we're not experts, it will get transformed in some way. And yes, I appreciate the necessity for that in terms of contextualization, but actually, can we truly contextualize something unless we really know that thing before we try to contextualize it? And I think we're trying to put the cart before the horse a little bit sometimes by, this is my context, what am I going to try and shoehorn in there? We've got a solution driving a problem situation, which is always an issue. And something that kind of sprung to mind when Kevin was just speaking was that, you know, kind of contextualization of ideas and thinking about learning to drive. And, you know, that's ultimately what us as teachers and leaders are trying to do, aren't we? We're trying to kind of steer these roads of educational research. But until you learn, until you pass that test, until you go through those checkpoints and develop your experience, actually being able to decide what to do at every single roundabout is really, really hard. You need to have lots of practice. You really need to know the rules of the road. And we're trying to navigate this in really kind of choppy waters, but also we're trying to navigate with very limited knowledge. So for me, just trying to bring it all back together, it's about having a sound knowledge base of these ideas and having real experts that are leading CPD and leading teacher training. That's really how we would go about avoiding this, and having that kind of robust adult learning curriculum for every school or local authority that was fit for purpose, but because it has been contextualized with genuine foundational knowledge.
Yeah, I think that balancing act you've got there that you've described about having knowledge, foundational knowledge, and contextualizing it in that way, I think that's a great way of describing what's going on there. Love the model of learning to drive as well. I've used that so often when talking about ideas and what we're doing as educators. Taj, is there anything you'd like to add about how we can prevent lethal mutations taking place?
I think one of the main things we can do is to make sure that we're not trying to implement too many things at the same time. I think there's always a danger of trying to do that, you know, there's so many different aspects of evidence-informed practice that you could try out, and then essentially what you then end up having is everybody being bombarded in every single situation. And I'm thinking about particularly in a primary framework, because when you think about the curriculum and the way that it's developing now, particularly when it's subject specific, you can imagine that's going to get overwhelming pretty quickly. You know, if we're saying that it would be difficult for secondary teachers with one subject to try and implement some of these ideas, and particularly with subject specific ideas as well, you know, when you're thinking about the practice of teaching physics or history or whatever it might be, if you're a primary teacher and you're having all of this come at you and you don't actually have that knowledge, the subject knowledge or the pedagogical knowledge or the evidence knowledge, it's going to get overwhelming quite quickly. And actually it's better to sort of focus on very specific areas of need and say, what is it? But also not to have the sort of silver bullet approach that we have. I can understand why we had it in primary, you know, because you know, you did want to see improvements across the board, but I think it's about saying, let's pick one thing and really implement it well. But, you know, I do appreciate what Neil was saying earlier, which is that, you know, it's not just that we're in, that we have to think about wider issues as well. So if you think about the accountability system, does it all actually add up? For example, is what we're being asked to do with curriculum actually matching up with what we're being asked to do in terms of accountability, and also in terms of what we're being asked to do in the classroom? Because if they don't, if there's no overall coherence and idea behind that, then actually, of course, you're going to have lethal mutations here, there and everywhere, or different year groups have to go off and do slightly different things, like year 2 or year 6, because they're SATs years.
Yeah, and I think you're right here with that golden thread that ties everything together. It's so important. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're pulling everyone in different directions. I think that's something that we've really got to avoid. Joe, anything from yourself regarding lethal mutations and preventing them?
So I think for me, I think it's really important that we remember that a lethal mutation will always come from a place of good intention. So if you've got a teacher who is doing something with evidence, but not doing it properly, that is not a bad thing. That means that that particular teacher is wanting to improve. So I think we've got to be really careful about how we deal with lethal mutations for a start. So I think that we don't put the onus on teachers to be implementing research, I'm going to say properly, because I know that obviously Neil was talking about how do we actually, you know, this is such a massive process. How do we know that implementation is being done properly? The drum that I would bang is that the implementation of anything, whether it's evidence-informed practice or anything else, has to be done really, really well. If you think about the, I'm sure you'd be familiar with the EAF guidance report on implementation, and it uses the analogy, I know Christian used it for a different thing, but the analogy of growing a garden. If you want to grow a garden, that is a really long-term, and again, I know we've talked about long-termism and short-termism, but it's a long-term thing. If you want a garden to grow and you want to do it well, you've got to prepare the land. Was it Jonathan Sharples that had said that it was, he'd come from here when he was gardening, he'd gone, actually, this is a bit like implementation in schools. So I think it's to prevent lethal mutations, we take the onus away from teaching, and it has to become a cultural, a school or a trust-wide culture, and it has to be through a process of really clear and really good and really nurturing implementation.
Yeah, I think the culture is absolutely massive, and I think it was mentioned by someone in one of the questions earlier about setting up a culture and what and why that is so important, and that 100% is why it's so important to make sure that people feel willing to take risks and willing to try a few different things out. I think that's so important. Christian, from yourself, anything about how we prevent lethal mutations taking place?
Yeah, I think we need to understand a bit about opportunity cost in the system, that, you know, the time spent doing X, is that the best use of that time? Could it actually be spent making Y that we've been doing for the last 2 years even better? And I think understanding that sometimes, I think in schools, again, because we have this desire to prove how hard we're working all the time, you know, particularly in light of an external environment that is often skeptical about how hard the profession works. I think we always want to be seen to be doing something, we always want to be seen to be busy. And sometimes doing nothing is actually the best thing you can do, you know, particularly in a context of great uncertainty about new ideas and new things as they come in. Sometimes just waiting and being quite, with a small c, conservative is not always a bad option, and developing the existing strengths that you've already got is actually perhaps a better bet. So I think, to me, it's just about, you know, and as someone that's a middle leader and is not necessarily in charge of, you know, in the school, you know, what new ideas or whatever are going to come in, you know, I think it's sometimes just about exercising real caution, thinking about workload implications. Is it really worth it? Is it going to actually improve things for the children? Much, if at all, and for the staff, much, if at all, would be my thing.
I think what a lot of people talk about there is do less and do it better, almost like, you know, don't necessarily think you've got to do everything, but do less, do it better. But also, if you're going to add something new in, take something out as part of it. What's going to go, so you can actually slip something in there. There's been a point from Susan, I'm not going to know what Joe said, and saying that teachers are struggling as it is. Expecting teachers to stay on top of research is usually demanding, but it's vital. So maybe research should be tied in with PD, and I think that's bang on the point. And just flipping back to what Joe said a minute ago, where she was saying about implementation. I mean, people can shoot me down on this if they want, but I'm a firm believer that if something goes wrong within the school, generally it's the leadership team's fault that something's gone wrong in the school, because it means they're not keeping their finger on the pulse. You know, if they've put a plan in place, it's their role to implement that plan, check in on that plan. So I agree with it. I agree entirely with what Joe said there, in the sense that we need, as leaders, when implementing plans, or whoever it is that's implementing a plan, needs to be the key person who's checking on the fact that things aren't mutating, and if they are, putting strategies in place to make sure things are still on track. You know, and that's the whole idea that I guess the EF are trying to sell, in terms of things being a process rather than an event. Neil, anything regarding how we can prevent mutations taking place?
I think there's one put a small caveat in, with particularly based on the example Louise was talking about in terms of biology. I mean, we're both biologists by training, so, you know, this is interesting. Mutations can sometimes be good. Sometimes actually mutations can be an evolutionary advantage, which And this is where I would say we can very quickly fall into linear thinking in terms of implementation. I think this is, I mean, people who do Joe's job, for example, which is a kind of a research lead across the school, I think it's incredibly challenging because we know so very little about how knowledge in a complex system, a complex social system, actually moves around, in particular to school. I mean, one of the questions you did have, I know we're not going to have time to do, is about the role of social media. Well, is social media an information source? Is it a knowledge broker? We don't know. Like, it kind of mixes between the two. We don't know very much about decision making. So I think the first thing we need to do is actually understand that this is a complex dynamic with how ideas move between research, knowledge brokers, at schools, and eventually the classroom, and how knowledge moves across these different sites, as it were. And I think we need greater awareness of that. Greater awareness that implementation is a very challenging aspect, and we almost need to research that in and of itself. So I'd say that as well. So I'd say this is the thing that I would say on a practical level, though, is one, not all mutations are bad. Sometimes they're neutral, sometimes they're good. And that really is down to the person who's leading and has the responsibility for implementation to determine that and evaluate that. And the other aspect of it is it's unavoidable. You're, by virtue of putting an idea into a system, that idea interacts within the system and new things emerge as a result. And so I think that idea of having a kind of a culture within a school, not the biggest fan of using that word, but of listening, that we are collecting not evidence in terms of hard evidence, but actually understanding how this is going, and then having an intrigue around what that means for what you're trying to implement. And I want to, I don't remember who said it particularly, but the idea of less is more. Actually, what do you place it? I've been hanging around with Matt Hutt too much, who talks about bets a lot. And I think that idea of what we place our bet on, that it comes back down to reflecting on our decision making, which Kristen was coming back to. Why are we making this decision? What is influencing us? What Louise was saying about biases. But ultimately, you know, we need to understand more about how, if we're going to take greater responsibility for the movement of knowledge through a system, what roles the schools are, research leads within that, etc., etc.
That's a great answer, Neil. So I know we've gone slightly over time, but I've been given the go-ahead to just have an opportunity to give everyone a chance to wrap up. So this next question is literally, you've got your soapbox, you've got 1 minute. What do you want to say about lethal mutations? So we're going to start with the order that we had right at the start. So we're going to Taj first. You've got 1 minute. What do you want to say about lethal mutations to wrap up?
I think I agree with Neil. I think they're inevitable, but I think that if we're going to prevent lethal mutations that are harmful, or that are just workload multipliers, for example, is to make sure that, first of all, that we really develop, provide the professional development for teachers in the first place, give them time to actually digest it and think about it and discuss it before actually implementing it, because I think that process, that time period doesn't always exist. I think too often it's, here's the research, go off and do it. And that discussion beforehand doesn't occur. And also, to make it relevant to the school and the context, is going to mutate if it becomes an add-on. So you really need to know why you're implementing any initiative or any piece of research in the first place.
I agree. I think there's so much I can get out of that. Louise.
Hello. So for me, I think to pick up on what Taj was just saying as well, we really need to make sure that we have that problem driving solution situation, rather than just an initiative for the sake of initiative, for the sake of someone seen to be doing something. I was having a conversation earlier with Joe about various initiatives that have arisen as a result of lockdown, and you know, people trying to prove their status. And unfortunately, we've got this phrase of the research, and then that becomes in itself a silver bullet that because the research says, like with feedback, then automatically we ought to do it. But I think if we're in a position as a profession where we want to change that, where we do want to become more research literate, we want to become an evidence-informed profession, we need to start at the beginning, have that as a real important factor as part of our teacher training, have a thorough, robust adult learning curriculum within each school or local authority or within a MAT. So therefore it is fit for purpose, fit for context, and make sure that we are giving the time and the status to CPD that is genuinely evidence informed, and make sure that training is there and being delivered by genuine experts that is truly evaluated and quality assured, rather than just something somebody read off the internet and it sounds all right.
I think so much. You know, so much that's so vital. 59 seconds, Louise, that was, so don't worry, 59 seconds. Kevin, you're up next.
I'd like to say that something to do with how social media is used to get these ideas out to the wider audience, to the public, to schools. If you think about one of the most popular type of strategies that's been implemented by schools since 2012 is Rosenshine's principles. I think that's had a massive impact on schools, on teachers, and has raised conversation and debate. But pre-2012, okay, so it's there. It's 2012. It was being implemented by Rosenshine's principles. Tom Sherrington brings it to attention via Twitter, and it just starts to explode. But I think the issue here is that you've got people who use Twitter, who are educators, who are teachers, who join this platform looking for the next big thing. So what's happened? Where are people sort of talking about what's useful in school? But they're not asking those really pertinent questions that I've kept talking about it the whole way through. It's just, what does it actually say? What does it show? Why does it work? And will it work in this context, in this school?
That's a great summary there. 52 seconds. So you did really well there as well. So next up is Jo.
So I think probably what I would just talk about to round off is that I think one of the biggest things that we need as teachers, if we are to implement things and we're going to do that properly in our classroom, is time. And so something that we've been doing in order to try and really embed evidence-informed practice properly within our trust is that we've completely scaled back on anything to do with performance management that is essentially kind of data-driven. So we don't have any performance management targets. The only expectation on our teachers is that they engage somehow with evidence, and you know, that doesn't even have to be a huge change. That could just be something like you know, tightening up their lesson starters or their homework or something like that, or their retrieval practice. So if we want to avoid our teachers doing something for the sake of it and then doing it, I'm going to say bad job, but I don't mean it in a critical way, then we have to provide, I'm going to go back to the gardening foundations and analogy, we have to provide the right foundations for them to be able to do that properly.
Great point there. Great point there, Jo. 1 minute, 5 seconds. You went over by 5
seconds.
Oh,
no. And I thought I was the most concise of everyone here.
No, you're the worst. Nothing new there, though, eh? Right, Neil, you're up next. So sorry. Neil, sorry, you're up next.
Am I? Oh, crikey. Right, that's my time going. Right, all I'm going to say is that a lot of the things that we've discussed, whether it's separating out our own individual positions from evidence, research, collaboration itself, making decisions in complex environments, these are not simple things for adults to do. They are actually very, very high up on the adult development scale. They are exceptionally challenging. And so first of all, to echo what Louise is saying, there needs to be a development of the adult itself throughout the career span, ITT, ECF going forward. And I think as well that it's that culture and understanding that mistakes will happen because it's a complex system. And actually what sort of culture, what sort of rules, regulations, systems can we put in place in our environments to support adult learning in relation to the fact that a lot of these aspects are not just hard, they are exceptionally hard for adults to engage with.
I think engaging with research is so hard. 58 seconds, Neil. That's a very close, very close. 58 seconds. Christian, you've got one shot to get it exactly on 60 seconds. Let's see if you can do this.
I'm a history teacher, I'll take longer. So two things just to follow up on what people have said. One, Twitter. I think Twitter's and social media and all that really good, because I think it's democratized knowledge in the profession. It's empowered people in the profession. It's spread knowledge to people in the profession in a way that wasn't happening, certainly in the earlier part of my career. And I think that's been a, broadly speaking, good thing. Secondly, with regard to what Joe was saying on appraisal, that sounds like a fantastic system. I think most schools could frankly take their appraisal system and dispose of them in the garbage, because that's how much use they are in improving teachers. And I think this idea of taking all the data out of it and focus on growing the professional, that's going to help us deal with this issue and have a better profession overall.
51 seconds, Christian. Well done.
I'll take that.
Well done. So just to wrap up a lot of the thoughts that people have said, we make mistakes when it comes to applying research for a few main ideas, as people have discussed. Sometimes we don't have the bandwidth and we don't have the time to analyze the research and how it needs to be adapted for our context. And I know a lot of that has come up about contextualizing research and putting it in place, whether that's a good thing to do, how we need to get that balancing act right. Mutations will happen. Some can be good, some can be neutral, some can be bad. And the only way to know this is to watch it carefully, watch that process of implementation really carefully. Have a think about how things fit alongside whatever is taking place, what needs to be removed to actually make something work. And research is carried out in controlled conditions. And let's be frank and honest, schools are not controlled conditions. And we need to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're taking into account what's happening in the school alongside the research that sits there. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Can I just say that I nailed that on exactly 60 seconds when I did that. And that is not rehearsed or anything. So if there's a winner, it's me, of course. But no, in terms of the panel, 59 seconds with Louise Lewis. Louise Lewis, you are the winner.